On a recent community post, I was asked, don't know how much you'd be willing to share, but I think a lot of us are curious about the mechanics of your life in Japan, e.g., what it takes to immigrate, get a visa, what kind of work is available to you, language acquisition process, etc. Might also be easy content if you need a buffer. Indeed, it is. I know many of you are here for the martial arts, and understandably so. It is a martial arts channel. I will talk about them at the end of the video, but I thought this would be a nice bit of a palate cleanser piece of content. And as he points out, yeah, this is a very chill video to make on the back end of content creation. So I feel like I need to start with something that everybody kind of knows about, but might feel like a strange entry point into this topic. And that is Japan's infamous birth rate and aging population wombo combo. This is sort of going to be a bit of a background force in this whole video. I'll speak more directly about it in a second, but for now it's important to acknowledge because the Japanese government seems to have finally woken up to this problem. To be more precise, they've known about it for a long time, but their economic policies have pretty much produced lukewarm results. Now, they seem to be breaking the glass in case of emergency, which is immigration. Now, before anyone gets to writing down in the comments, I know immigration is a contentious topic. Specifically, my feeling is that immigrants who move to a country simply for the benefits and who have zero intention of integrating or cherishing the privilege of being there don't deserve to get in. I'm not really down to swing the doors wide open to every person. In the same vein, I think a lot of Westerners view Japan as some kind of fairy tale land theme park, and while I think some degree of Japanophilia is almost required to live in and appreciate the country, there is a qualitative difference between appreciation and fetishization. The critical point to make in all of this, though, is that they are breaking the glass very slowly and very quietly. My gut tells me that they are doing this so as to not spook the older, more socially conservative Japanese population who, as you'd expect with the nation's reputation, make up a massive amount of the demographics. I start with all of this because it has led to several pretty new visas. First, the highly skilled professional visa, or highly skilled labor visa. I'm not exactly clear on the perfect translation. This is basically for people who have extremely desirable skills. Usually that's going to be something in tech, but it could range from medicine to infrastructure. It doesn't really matter as long as it's a niche that is highly desired by Japan. This is how I got here, or to be more precise, my wife has this visa and I got to come here as her spouse, so lucky me. I've since changed my visa over to a normal work visa though, much more on that in a second. Some of you might be curious why my wife has a visa and she is also foreign, except rather than being from America, she is Chinese, also an Aikido practitioner for what it's worth. One of the other new visas is the digital nomad visa. This is even newer than the aforementioned highly skilled professional visa and basically allows you to live here for 6 months, but is unfortunately not renewable as of writing this script. In other words, you'd have to go home when your 6 months are up. This could be one way to dip your toes into the country, though. I'm also not sure if you can change visas while on the digital nomad visa, but I assume you could. I'm not using that one. I don't know much about it. Don't use me as a resource. Just go to the Japanese immigration website and read it for yourself. Then there are the old classics. Get married to a Japanese person, come as a student, come on a cultural visa, or get a job before arrival, so you can be sponsored for a normal work visa. The first two are self-explanatory. The cultural visa means you usually have a sponsor who's going to teach you something unique to Japan. Martial arts are an example. The downside is I don't believe you can work on a cultural visa, or you can work very, very little, like 20 hours. So you're more or less financing the whole trip beforehand. The work visa feels like it ought to be the standard route, but getting a job in Japan while living abroad can be very tricky. If it isn't tricky, because you have a highly sought after skill, then you should probably be applying for the highly skilled professional visa anyway. If you wanted to just dip your toes into living here, my suggestion would probably be the digital nomad visa if you can manage, or the student visa if you are a student. If you have the expendable income, a cultural visa is also an option. But of course, you can, and probably should, just come as a tourist before you make any life-altering commitments. It may or may not be what you imagine. Keep in mind, I lived in Japan for close to 4 years, and it was only after COVID and a lot of talks with my wife that we finally decided to move here permanently. Now, all these visas come with certain bells and whistles too that I'm not entirely confident enough to educate you on, stuff like tax breaks, housing subsidies, and the like. I plan on being here basically for the rest of my life, so I'll eventually encounter some of that stuff, but I haven't yet, and I just thought it was worth mentioning at least a little bit here. I mentioned that I moved from a spouse visa to a working visa. Basically, all that entails is getting hired and the company sponsoring your visa change. What am I doing for work then? Classic English-speaking white guy shit. I'm teaching English to kids. This job gets a lot of hate online, especially Reddit. It is often deserved hate, but it's one of those things where if you understand that it's basically an entry-paying job and you're willing to take it for what it is, then it's not that horrific depending on the company you get into. Keep in mind, I was working in warehouses during COVID on American soil, which eventually funded my trip here. So my experience with bullshit, both on a ground level and a corporate level, is pretty great at this point. For me, I envision this job as basically just a transitional thing, which I suspect most people probably should if you're planning on living here long term. If we live on my meager salary from this, we can shove my wife's cut of the pie into savings and investments. I wouldn't generally recommend anyone make a career out of teaching English in Japan. You certainly can. Some people do. But I think most people should just use it as a job so they can save up some money while they are learning the language. Speaking of, I say that my job is a transitional thing. Why not have just gone for a quote-unquote real job right out of the gate? Great question. Glad you asked. The big hurdle is mainly getting my JLPT N2. For the uninitiated, the JLPT is a Japanese proficiency test, and the N2 level is considered business level. Basically, employers look for that certification when it comes to foreigners. Now, a follow-up question you might have is, damn, you've lived in Japan for 4 years. How is your Japanese not at business level? There are a few angles to my answer to that. First is that I never really took studying for the JLPT all that seriously. Obviously, I regret that now, but back when I was making that choice and I didn't think I was going to come back to Japan full time, it was a fairly sober decision. The JLPT is a standardized test, and if you've ever taken a standardized test, I assume most of you have, you know that they don't always reflect reality. In many ways, what the JLPT prepares you for is to be an office drone. While I was going through my schooling here, I wanted to be a Japanese history teacher in the US. So my thought process was that I should focus on the Japanese related to history, the stuff I was actually working on, as opposed to reading the shit about how Takahashi-san is late on his report about Q3 earnings. But beyond that, I had no real intention to live in Japan at the time. I really wanted to just focus on the language as it directly related to my studies. And to be frank with you, the JLPT study is ruthlessly boring in my opinion. So the idea here is that I do this English teaching job for a little while, grind the hell out of study materials, pass the N2, and start transitioning into a job, if you know what I mean. I do have a degree from a Japanese university. I feel like I should be able to make that jump once I have the proper JLPT certification. Another possibility that I've mulled is going back to school. I do have a master's in Japanese history, but I'm not too optimistic about that market in particular. I've even considered going to a trade school because in a world that is increasingly corporate and tech-based, I have a sense that the world is going to need people who can build and fix things. It seems like fewer and fewer people want to do that, which just means the people that can are going to be able to name their price in those fields. I feel like if I play my cards right, I could also find some intersection between my love of Japanese history and, say, carpentry, as just an example. That's all just theory crafting, though. Before anything, I need to stick my nose in some books and crank out some good JLPT results. For the record, for those curious, my Japanese is all right. I can hold conversations and I can even work my way through certain history books because that is what I focused on during my student days. As for other education, I was really good at getting completely shit-faced on booze and having conversations with people. That's where most of my conversation skills were grown. I'm at a Japanese level now where the hard rules of grammar and things of that like start to break down, and that's just really sending me for a bit of a loop. I'm going to say something that Japanese language channels probably won't tell you, and that's that learning Japanese gets fucking hard after a certain point. It's all fun and games until the grammar starts to go a little wild, and every language does this. Every language has this level where 2 plus 2 starts to equal 4 only part of the time, but it just is what it is. As someone who wants to be here possibly for the remainder of my days, I feel getting a grip on the language is as much a duty as it is an avenue for economic profit. Like I said previously, I support immigration insofar as the immigrant population actually makes an effort to properly integrate. A big part of that is language, so I'm just walking the walk, so to speak. Eventually, these things will all add up towards my application for permanent residency. The way that works is a bunch of different conditions have a numerical point attached to them. Graduation from Japanese university, for example, might give you 15 points. After you accumulate enough of these points, you are eligible for permanent residency. It can be pretty difficult to pick up all of these in a short period of time, but it isn't impossible with consistency and a long-term plan. It is basically a massive fetch quest, but at least it's still somehow less opaque than my home country's mess of an immigration system. A quick note on the economic situation here. As an American, getting to Japan tends to be the expensive part. Being in Japan, assuming you have a source of income, is typically very sustainable. Sustainability is a double-edged sword, though. Generally, prices are very affordable, but it also feels like you're never getting ahead in relation to your salary alone. Obviously, you can get around this by working multiple jobs and or being a two-income household, but it is just something I'd like to point out. Some of you might also wonder why on earth I'd moved to Japan in the midst of all this doom and gloom, the population crisis in particular. The truth is that yes, in the short term, I suspect things in Japan are probably going to be difficult. They may very well even get worse. There are some benefits we could take advantage of, though, as a result of the crisis. Namely, a lot of old houses are empty and cheap, and child rearing is heavily subsidized. I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, as these two things could probably be their own videos, and this isn't really the channel for that. The old houses, for example, are very cool, but they can also be absolute money pits if you're not careful. They will chew through your savings like nothing else. It isn't like you get cheap things with no strings attached. Many are fixer-uppers that you are solely responsible for. The government does not help you. The child-rearing help also is contingent on your residency status. There will also, of course, be labor shortages, hence the government's slow turn towards new visas and a cleaned-up immigration system. Now, there is always the possibility that Japan keeps getting these idiotic foreigners ruining everything for everyone, but at least right now, the trend points to Japan continuing to open up and being easier to move to. In recent times, I'm hearing a lot less about robots or AI or heavy government support being a true fix to the demographic crisis. In truth, I think Japan has probably passed the point of no return in terms of the demographic crisis, though. They might be able to slow it down and make it more manageable, but I don't think we are going to see a return to sustainable birth levels for a long time, and there probably will be a lot of strain on the social programs because of an age-heavy population. Again, I think that sounds very scary to some people, but in truth, the demographic crisis seems to be coming for all first world countries. Even America is really only staving it off with immigration, but that's a whole other can of worms that I won't get into here. The reality is that it seems like demographic issues and developed countries go together like macaroni and cheese. What I am a bit bullish on, however, is that Japan, being a country which this problem is pretty advanced, ought to be among the first nations to stabilize. If I'm very, very, very lucky, I'll get to enjoy some of that boom as I retire. Meanwhile, the rest of the world will still be grinding through their respective demographic issues. And if I'm not so lucky, which is very possible, my kids, in theory, should be able to enjoy the boom of a country that is restabilizing. On top of that, being able to speak English, Japanese, and Mandarin should be great for my children. Unless something crazy happens, I suspect the US, China, and Japan will still be economic powerhouses in the short term, so I like my kids' odds. For the record, I don't have a kid right now, but obviously we are planning for one. All right, finally, I'll talk a bit about training martial arts since this is a martial arts channel. Go figure. Similar to back home, a lot of gyms and dojos have their own character and culture. Some are great, some suck. So inevitably, you're going to be shopping around. There are a few major differences, though. One is that I'd say the market is hyper-defined in Japan. And what I mean by that is that karate, kendo, judo, and so on kind of exist in their own little world. There's very little cross-pollination in my experience, and all the Japanese arts have this horrendously rigid perception of exactly how everything should be. There is very little deviation outside of what they perceive to be correct and traditional. The key word here being perceive, because a lot of what passes for traditional here is in fact pretty newly invented. If you're new to martial arts, this probably isn't a big deal. If you're far enough into your career where you have pesky things like opinions and individual values, this is going to suck more times than not, I think. I struggle with this because I do want to integrate, but also in many cases I actually feel like I know the history better than some of these teachers, and I know when something is just not historical or traditional or practical. But that's what happens when you study this with the aim of doing it for a living. Obviously, I'm not doing that, but I can't unlearn the fact that I know that some of these traditions were made up in like the 70s. They aren't exactly ancient as they are portrayed. One of the big issues with Japanese culture, and this relates back to the very aged population, is that there are a lot of old people at the top who are stuck in their ways. This is kind of expected in any cultural context, but in Japan there really aren't any socially appropriate methods to push back on this and balance it out. The best martial arts have is competition. If you do something there and it works, oftentimes the older generation will kind of keep quiet about it, but trust me, they would still prefer you do things their way. If you're doing an art without a competitive outlet, though, good fucking luck. There is almost certainly a committee of crusty old dudes all awarding ranks to one another who are one-sidedly policing the direction of the whole art. Sometimes these groups make decent decisions, genuinely, but I personally think they are typically out of touch with younger people, which is, of course, pretty bad in this industry because young people are usually the demographic for martial arts. So dealing with this is very difficult. There are, of course, martial arts that are philosophically very forward-thinking, but these tend to be smaller and more niche. The painful irony here is that the Japanese public tends to look at a long tradition as a badge of quality, which then tends to reinforce the habit these arts have of never changing or experimenting outside of their normal bounds. Even in something as seemingly modern as judo, for example, there are teachers that I've personally heard say that there will never be any new techniques in judo except the stuff they already have. Now, don't get me wrong, it's very true that a truly new technique is unlikely, but I find this way of thinking almost antithetical with the ethos of judo. Early judo was an extremely progressive martial art, and it was built on the premise that Japanese martial arts actually needed to be reinvented in order to survive. We could split hairs about how much of that reinvention was a repackaging, but my point was that judo was very forward-looking. Now, it seems like on a good day, it stays exactly the same, and on a bad day, it actually subtracts from what it has. Cough, cough, leg grab, ban. Judo is far, far from the only Japanese art doing this, for the record, but I think many people have this image of it being a very modern kind of practice. The reality, in my experience, is pretty different. And again, keep in mind that this is an art with that competitive outlet to push back against aged, calcified hierarchies. Imagine this problem in arts without an avenue for dialogue. At any rate, because these arts are so often so defined, I don't see many people truly cross-training. Like, sure, there are MMAs and kudos in the space, but what I mean is that it's kind of rare to find someone training judo on Tuesday and aikido on Friday or something like that. Some of this is down to work schedules and stuff, but I still find it strange. Tokyo is a mega city, and historically, this is where Japanese martial arts came to intermingle and exchange ideas. Now it feels like everything is extremely in its own lane, and I kind of hate it. Again, you can find martial arts that break this mold, MMA, BJJ, Kudo, and actually, although I wouldn't consider it truly martial, Taito is fairly forward-looking, but some of this is taste too. When I first came here and was a student, I was like, sure, whatever, I'll train anything. And even today, I'm more than willing to slap on a white belt and just train. The older I get, though, the less stock I really put into the whole belt thing, and submitting myself to the training unto itself isn't really a problem for me. I think a lot of my issue is actually in the presentation at the end of the day. I sense that if teachers were like, I do it this way, but this way is also correct and acceptable, I'd have way less to complain about here. The problem I see is I do it this way, and if you don't, you're objectively wrong. I would stress, though, that some of this kind of behavior isn't art-wide. Martial arts are not monoliths, and the internet sometimes likes to paint them as them. There are progressive elements even in something as conservative as Aikido, for example. It's just usually they kind of speak in whispers and train differently only when the teacher isn't around. And I guess in some ways that is very Japanese. So much of what Japanese martial arts are today, both the good and the bad, exist because some wily kids at one point decided to train more after their teacher went back home. But it does frustrate me that in arts like Aikido, for example, there are a bunch of 60, 70, 80-year-old men who are so high rank that nobody can actually criticize their technique teaching. And I'm not really blaming these old guys, but when you train in a particular way for 20 years with zero criticism and zero feedback, there are going to be flaws that sneak into your thoughts and your techniques. And then you're just passing those habits on without really any kind of way to constructively criticize. And obviously the new generation doesn't really know any better because they're learning from the ground up. That's a problem to me when you're 70 years old and you're doing stuff and you don't have any critics, really. Now, maybe you have people who are gently nudging you in a certain way, but eventually you have your own dojo, your gazillionth level dan and a Shivan art, and no one's going to say anything. I just don't like that very much. It's a great way to breed problems. Other than that, training is mostly going to be about fitting it into your schedule, your budget, how far things are away from you, because Tokyo is absolutely freakishly massive. I don't think many people recognize that. I've made a few posts about how difficult a time I have been having trying to find a good place to train, and some people have been like, well, just train this. It's Tokyo. It's like, I don't think you understand. You could travel on the trains for probably 2 or 3 hours and you still wouldn't be on the other side of Tokyo. And there is a cost associated with transportation. It's usually pretty cheap, but it can add up if you're going 3-4 times a week, which I would very much like to be. Aside from wrestling with calcified traditions and all of the other kind of normal things like transportation and fitting things into your schedule, I will say that generally dojos here are like super clean and pretty well structured. You're not going to run into a place where it feels like people are just winging it or you're going to get a staph infection, which is good. There's also the whole sports center culture, which is very interesting. Basically, you can just go to a sports center and figure out what martial arts are training there. These places are often very cheap, but they will generally pull you into a larger organization where you have more chances to train with just a more diverse range of people. The sports center culture is actually pretty cool, in my opinion. But yeah, training here is good if you come into it with less expectations. Maybe that's true of everywhere. Maybe I just have the great burden of knowing things and having opinions at this point in my career, both historically speaking, like academically speaking, and in martial arts in general. But yeah, that's training here. There's good, there's bad. I'm still kind of looking around. My general feeling is that you're going to have more success with foreign martial arts and some of the more forward-looking martial arts, Kudo, Taido, those sorts of things, if you're more interested in like a Western tone. That said, I can't help but speak positive things about my club activity experience. I have now come to realize what a rare experience that was. The club activities in Japan for university students is what I mean, are absolutely next level. Like, you train all the time. I probably trained more than I studied, quite frankly, which maybe wasn't the wisest idea career wise, but I got really good really fast. And I'm not saying that to kind of stroke my own ego or anything. I just mean anybody that trains 30 hours a week at that level of rigor is going to get good at something. And that's what we were doing in the Aikido club back then. Again, probably should have spent more time on my studies, but here we are. So there's good, there's bad with the training. There is kind of a tourism for training. There's drop-in fees just like anywhere else. These are usually pretty fair. The pricing here is typically pretty fair too. Some get a little expensive and I wonder why, but most are fairly cheap. So there's not really that in the mix. So again, yeah, it's just a mixture of good and bad. If you want to train here, it's going to be like anywhere else. You're going to have to poke around. If you're only here for 30 days, you may or may not have a good experience. If you're here for a long period of time, you may well have the time to actually locate a place that suits you well. It's just down to a little bit of luck and a lot of hard work. And I think that addresses the original question pretty thoroughly. There's obviously other things in the background of this, like I'm on literally the other side of the planet from my home country, so it's not like I see my family physically that frequently. But, you know, for me, that's never been too big of an issue. I love my family, don't get me wrong. I'm just a fairly solitary person anyway, so wherever I lay my hat and all that. But for some people, that can be a deal breaker. I've seen people come here thinking it's going to be a great time and then feel very isolated very quickly and want to go back. So that's something to take into consideration. But yeah, that's immigrating, that's the visas, that's the work situation, the economic situation, the training situation, the social situation a little bit. I think I covered everything. If you got more questions or more specific questions, you can ask them in the comments and I will try to answer whatever you have if I can answer it correctly. Obviously, my personal experiences are no substitute for proper research. A lot of what I talked about is online. Check out the Japanese immigration services if this is something you're interested in. Again, I would always recommend coming as a tourist first. Getting here is always more expensive than being here, but budget properly. Other than that, I would recommend that people at least try it out, especially if you're interested in Japanese martial arts or Japanese culture. Keep in mind that it is not fairy tale anime land over here. The Japanese people are people. The society has problems, just like anywhere else. And yeah, if you come with those kinds of expectations, you'll probably have a generally pretty good time. Just please don't be an idiot. Come with at least a little bit of Japanese under your belt. You know, make the effort. It is 2024. I don't think anybody should be traveling anywhere without at least a couple basic phrases native to the place that they're going to. That kind of stuff is really easy to learn. You can probably do most of it on the airplane while you're coming. It's a very long flight. I'm not saying you have to be fluent, but please, some basic Japanese would be great. And just respect the local customs. Clean up after yourself. Don't be super loud on the trains. Yada, 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 yada. Do as they do here. Pretty simple, basic travel etiquette, but seems like a lot of people these days don't understand that. Anyway, that's all I've got. Any more questions, pop them into the comments. I'll do what I can to answer them for you. Thank you so much for listening. I know this was a little bit off the beaten path of my normal theming. I will get back to that very shortly. This isn't going to become like a Japan vlog channel or anything like that. Maybe I could do a side channel like that at some point if people are super interested. But yeah, that's it. Catch you all on the next one. Thanks for watching. Peace.